On August 31st, 1969, Rocky Marciano died in a plane crash in Iowa. He left behind not only a perfect record of 49-0, but also an eternal legacy. His style of fighting and spirit inspired millions, including Sylvester Stallone, who created the character of Rocky Balboa, a symbol of perseverance and willpower. Marciano became a beacon for the working class, a hero who rose from the bottom to reach the pinnacle of success. But that's the bright side of Marciano's story that everyone knows. However, Marciano also had a darker side. Ties to the mob, rumors of fixed fights, and even the fact that his name, Rocky, wasn't his real one. To truly understand who Marciano was, we need to delve into his past. Start with his childhood? No. To uncover the full picture, we need to go even further back, to his father's childhood. In 1894, Pierino Marchigiano was born in the Abruzzo region in the center of Italy. In early 1917, at the age of 23, fleeing the war, Pierino left Italy for the United States. Upon arrival, he got a job at a shoe factory in Brockton, Massachusetts. But in a matter of weeks, in April 1917, the States entered World War I. Pierino was drafted into the Army.
Remember, the United States is a nation of immigrants. People came here to avoid war in Europe.
The Americans had, from the very beginning, an official policy of neutrality. But neutrality never meant indifference or apathy.
Even though we're saying we don't want to involve ourselves, we certainly were sympathetic in trying to help and aid that cause in ways that the Germans saw as being destructive to their war aims. So in all those ways, the Wilson administration is walking a tightrope.
Woodrow Wilson, after all, runs for re-election in 1916 on the slogan, "He kept us out of war." And yet, within a year after winning that election, that very same president is declaring war.
So Marchigiano, who had fled the war, found himself in the middle of it. He was sent to Europe, where as a member of the Marine Corps, he participated in battles and was wounded in the jaw. Many years later, Pierino, recalling the incident, said, "My teeth were knocked out. I spit them out and continued the fight." Being shot in the jaw and having his teeth knocked out didn't stop Pierino. What did stop him was the mustard gas that the German army used on the battlefield in 1917.
So Woodrow Wilson is going through this massive personal crisis the moment that Europe has exploded in war. It takes him a few weeks to issue an official declaration that America will remain neutral in this conflict. And this is because people think that this will be a quick war, and he understands we have people that come from all the nations that are involved, and he does not want arguments over this European war to tear American society apart. The problem is that the war does not end quickly. And so once the war goes into 1915, the question is, what will Americans do? 4 million men in arms. So over 19 months, the American military is going to have to grow incredibly.
The United States adopts conscription, mandatory military service that applied to men between the ages of 18 and 45. Within a very short period of time, the United States turns from having one of the smallest armies in the world to, in fact, having one of the largest.
The exposure undermined Pierino's health, and he was sent back to the States. Upon his return, he settled back in Brockton and went to work in a shoe factory again. And in 1920, he met a girl named Pasqualina Picciuto, who had moved from Italy to the United States just after the end of World War I in 1918, and her family settled in Brockton. They were married in August 1921. Their first child died shortly after birth. The exact causes are unknown, but after the child's death, a doctor told the Marchigiano family the shocking news that they should not try to have children because it was very likely they would suffer the same fate. Pierino and Pasqualina refused to believe it. On September 1st, 1923, they had a son, whom Pierino named after his father. The child's full name was Rocco Francis Marchigiano. When the baby was 1.5 years old, he fell ill with pneumonia. The prognosis of doctors was unfavorable. The chances of survival were minimal. One of the doctors said that if the child survived, it would only be through character. And he did. It was the first big victory of Rocco's life, which also gave his parents hope. After that,
we certainly didn't know we were poor. We ate the very best, and we always had, there was always enough for the whole family. It was very crowded conditions, and we had a cellar where my grandfather used to make wine, homemade wine, and from Rocky as a young boy used to haul all of the grapes into the basement, and that was like a ritual.
It was very cramped, but warm, very warm. We had a refrigerator, like an icebox rather than a refrige. Little small dining room. Our grandparents were downstairs. It was nice. It was very warm. It was cozy, and it was safe.
there were 5 more children in the Marciano family, a total of 3 boys and 3 girls. But it was Rocco who became the symbol of hope that the Marciano family could be big and healthy. Although no one called Rocco Rocky back then for convenience, I will refer to him that way. In 1936, a young player named Joe DiMaggio made his Major League Baseball debut for the New York Yankees. In his first season, he set the record for the most home runs by a rookie. That record wasn't broken until 2017. But in 1936, the young player's success in Bangkok was being watched by 13-year-old Rocky, for whom the #1 sport was baseball. And DiMaggio, being as much from a family of Italian immigrants as Rocky himself, became a sports reference point for him. The 30s of the 20th century is a period of Great Depression, and for boys from poor families having the same humble beginnings, athletes were real heroes. Marciano played baseball at Brockton High. However, the coach had a low opinion of the young player's skills. So in 10th grade, Rocky started playing for a Christian league team, for which he was expelled from the school team. Since the rules, if you are a member of the school team, to train and play in other teams is forbidden. Rocky also played American soccer, but he was a slow runner, so he had no prospects at all. Rocky dropped out of school after 10th grade in 1940 to concentrate on baseball on the one hand, and on the other, to start working to help his father support the family. The states were still suffering the effects of the 1929 stock market crash and the Great Depression that followed. Inside, Rocky burned a dream of becoming a Major League Baseball player and providing for his family so that his father would no longer have to work in a factory. But when it came time to be selected to continue his career on the baseball team, Rocky did not qualify. Dreams of big athletic victories were certainly not crushed, but suffered a hard blow. Rocky went to work. He unloaded coal for 50 cents an hour. He didn't work a full shift, so he looked for part-time work, digging holes, laying railroad tracks, working in a candy factory, washing dishes in restaurants and cafes, shoveling snow, delivering beer. He took any job that came his way. He also worked part-time at the shoe factory where his father worked. But he worked there for a short time because it turned out that Rocky is allergic to dust from the materials that arise in the manufacture of shoes. Rocky was a persistent guy, but very quiet. Nevertheless, he managed to get into the middle of street fights, but he never started the fights. It was his friends who got in trouble.
He was always a class act. We were the wise guys that got the fights for him.
Rocky was very, very quiet, very shy.
He was girl shy, I know that.
He was the big brother that always protected us, and I always felt more protected because I was so much younger.
In December 1941, the United States entered World War II. On March 4th, 19 years old Rocky Marciano was drafted into the Army on March 4th, 1943. In the summer of 1943, he was sent to Swansea, Wales as a member of the 150th Engineer Battalion. On June 6, 1944, a date known in the United States as D-Day, the Normandy landing took place, which marked the beginning of the operation called Overlord. Other names are Operation Normandy, Battle of Normandy. This is the largest amphibious operation in history. in which about 2.5 million people took part. It was on June 6, the first day, that 160,000 soldiers crossed the channel. The goal was to create a bridgehead and squeeze the German forces from the territory of France, and then the attack on Germany. The 150th Battalion, in which Marciano served, was engaged in the maintenance and dispatch of landing boats from Britain to France during the Battle of Normandy. It was in the Army Rocky Marciano got acquainted with boxing. It's true, forced. He did not like working in the kitchen, so he decided that it is better to test himself in boxing, not in peeling potatoes. Boxing helped him more than once. After the surrender of Japan was signed in September 1945, Marciano had to go there as part of the occupation troops. He was already in the States at the time, and he didn't want to go far away from home again. And then he received an offer to play in the Army boxing tournaments in the United States, and he agreed. In early 1946, Rocky won one of these tournaments. In March of the same year, the term of service ended.
The Army was pretty good for Marciano. He ended up training over here in the States and then serving a time in Wales. And I think he saw different people, and I think he came back more determined than ever to get out of this succession of menial jobs that he had sort of chosen for himself. And he hadn't finished high school, so he knew the way out, the avenue out, was sports. And that's what he pursued.
In the Army, Rocky became friends with one of his co-workers named Joe Sorelli. Sorelli's father had connections in boxing, so Rocky asked his friend to introduce him to his father so he could appreciate his boxing abilities. His father took me to a gym in Chicago. For 3 days, I hit the bag, jumped on the rope, boxed with shadow boxing. When the training was over, Joe's father came up to me and said, "Rocky, why don't you go home and forget about being a boxer? You're too small for a heavyweight. You're not going to make it." Marciano is 1.78 meters tall, arm span 1.7 meters. He weighed about 85 kilos. The reigning world super heavyweight champion at the time, Joe Louis, was heavier by about 10 kilo, taller by 9 centimeters, and his arm span was larger by 23 centimeters. Nevertheless, Rocky continued to compete at the amateur level. Not to say that he liked boxing very much. Marciano liked to load himself physically, and boxing was great for that. But Rocky wasn't going to make a career out of it, especially after the grade he got from Sorelli in Chicago. What's more, Rocky was even glad that now he could put boxing on the back burner because he was still on fire for baseball. In 1947, Joe DiMaggio, whom I mentioned earlier and whose fan was Rocky, in the New York Yankee lineup, became the champion for the 6th time, and was one of the wealthiest and most recognizable athletes in the country. With all the restraint and modesty, even shyness, Rocky Marciano wanted to leave a mark in history, wanted to do something that will keep his memory forever, and of course, to make a lot of money. As those who knew him said, Rocky Marciano's greatest fear was obscurity and poverty. He was afraid of being a nobody and being poor for the rest of his life. One of Marciano's close friends was the world featherweight champion, Willie Pep, and these are his words. Rocky once told me, "When I was a kid, my life was hard. It's never going to be like that again. I'll never be poor again, Willie. Never again." In March 1947, Marciano traveled to North Carolina to participate in the annual tryouts for the Fayetteville Caps, a team that was a supplier of young talent to the Chicago Cubs Major League Baseball team. After 3 weeks of practice games, Rocky was expelled. That still didn't stop him. So he tried to make it to one of the Division IV teams. But he failed again. And now he had finally accepted that he was never going to be a baseball player. After the draft, I said to myself, screw it, I'm done with baseball. I'm gonna try out for some fights. In April 1947, Marciano returned to his native Brockton, where he again took a half-time job as a coal loader, but for $1 an hour. But for now, Let's go back a month to March 1947. A few days before he went to North Carolina in an attempt to start a baseball career, he had a professional boxing match. He entered the professional ring because they offered $25,000 for the fight. And for Rocky, that was a lot of money. Unloading coal for 4 hours a day, he needed 6 days to earn $24. And here, Rocky knocked out his opponent in the 3rd round and got $25 for less than 10 minutes of work. Marciano did the fight under the alias Rocky Magician. At the time, he did not yet know that his baseball career would infamously end in just a few weeks. So he didn't consider professional boxing as his main activity, but he still wanted to keep amateur boxing as a backup. Becoming a national boxing champion or even a national medalist in those years was a great accomplishment, all the more reason to qualify for the Olympics. And when baseball was done, Rocky focused on boxing. The whole neighborhood helped out in the amateur ring. The sponsor was the owner of a Brockton auto repair shop, and Rocky's neighbor, Eli Colombo, was his manager and second in command. Who dreamed of a career as an athlete? But nature did not endow him with physical data. However, Eli was good at making acquaintances. At the time, he was on the farthest reaches of the boxing business. But this is something, and there is a place to start. From the spring of 1947 to the spring of 1948, Rocky had about 30 amateur fights, most of which did not get into the statistics. So most often you can find information that the record of Marciano in the amateurs 8 wins and 4 losses. In terms of skill as a boxer, Rocky was below average, and that's putting it mildly. But he was saved by his heavy punching and the ability to hold his punches. Rocky's father, Joe Marciano, was a rather modestly sized man. Height 1.72 mas, weight 68 kilo, but the mother was much larger. She was about the same height but weighed 90 kilo.
Mom was a kind of a robust woman, and Rocky oftentimes said that he felt as though he got his physical strength from maybe Mom's side of the family.
At the start of his career, the biggest problem was that neither Rocky nor Eli Colombo knew how to tape his hands, which made the aspiring boxer a frequent visitor to the Brockton Trauma Center. In March 1948, Marciano traveled to New York for the Golden Gloves tournament among the Eastern states. In the first bout, his opponent was Collie Volos, whom the press dubbed the new Joe Louis, looking ahead to say that the champion Wallace did not become a champion, but Joe Louis became, and 3 times. What do you mean by that? After the end of his career, Volos turned to acting. He starred in several films, among which can be distinguished 3: The Joe Louis Story, Marciano, and Raging Bull. In all 3, Collie Volos played Joe Louis. Here is a shot from Raging Bull, where Luis, played by Volos, congratulates LaMotta, played by Robert De Niro, on his championship. Well, meanwhile, in March 1947, in the first fight at the tournament Golden Gloves East, the clear favorite of the fight against unknown to anyone, Rocco Francis Marciano from Brockton, looked like a clear outsider. Maybe an underestimation of his opponent played a role, but to the surprise of journalists, this Francis, as his too difficult to remember surname, chased the rising star around the ring. Rocco won the fight, but who is he against the new Joe Louis? The judges gave the victory to Volos. Moreover, one of the reputable journalists, apparently trying to save the reputation of the rising star, wrote in an article that Volos knocked Rocky down twice. That didn't happen though, and has been confirmed by numerous other reporters. That same month, Marciano traveled to the New England tournament. This is a championship among boxers from 6 American states located in the northeastern United States. Rocky won the tournament, becoming the New England champion, but he injured his thumb, and it prejudiced his future path. Just a month later, in April, the U.S. championships were to be held, the winners of which would qualify for the Olympics. Because of the injury, Rocky could not perform at the national tournament, and therefore, the chance to be selected for the Olympics evaporated. Moreover, Rocky and Eli Colombo quickly found out that in amateur boxing, you also need connections. Now Rocky was left with only one single path to the coveted glory: professional boxing. Only Rocky had spent all his savings on treatment for his hand injuries, so money was needed. So Rocky tasked his friend and manager Eli Colombo to find outlets for fights in Boston. It's the capital and largest city of Massachusetts. From Brockton to Boston is only 30 kilometers by car, so it made sense to look for contacts there. Colombo turned to one of his acquaintances, Eddie Boland, and he said there was nothing to do in Boston. If you really want to get to a place where big boxing and big money, then your way is not 30 kilometers north, but 300 kilometers south, in New York. In addition, Rocky was already more or less known in the boxing community in Massachusetts and Boston in particular. He didn't have any big fans. Of all the heavyweight guys in Massachusetts, Rocky had the least chance of success. He was gaunt and clumsy. He had no stand-up, no style, nothing at all. I didn't think he was going to make it. He was too old to start a career. He's almost 25 years old. He was too small, too light, arms short. Yes, durable, with punch, but no finesse. New York, though close in distance, seemed a very distant place in terms of status. It is unlikely that influential promoters and spectators in the capital of world boxing are just waiting for the clumsy guy from Brockton to come to them. So Marciano and Colombo decided to try their luck in Boston after all. They went from one promoter to another, but everywhere they were rejected. Then they realized what Eddie Boland was talking about when he advised to go straight to New York. Boland didn't believe in Rocky either, but this success-hungry and Taz-American was an attractive guy who wanted to help. Boland advised him not to change his mind and go straight to a man named Al Weil. Those who have watched all the documentaries on this channel already know who this man is, but we will look at his figure in more detail anyway. Boland gave Weil the message that he was vouching for the young heavyweight Marciano. At the same time, El Colombo sent Weil a letter in which he described Rocky as a boxer who could win a championship title if his career was taken care of by big people. Weil was interested and invited Rocky to New York with El. They drove down for a meeting, and when Weil saw Marciano, the following happened.
And Al Weil looked at him immediately, said, you know, kid, where are you from? Brockton, Massachusetts. You know what? Why don't you go back to Brockton, marry a nice girl, have 6, 7, 8 kids, and enjoy your life. You don't want to be a boxer. But Rocky was determined. Rocky knew what he wanted to do. Al Weil said, okay, sent him over to the gym, meet up with this guy about 4'9", Charlie Goldman, who looks like he had 350 fights and lost every one of them. And he was the guy, the genius, that saw Rocky, saw him for what he was, and the rest is history.
Rocky was sparring with a heavyweight named Vite Chansey who had won several regional tournaments in the amateurs, but things didn't work out in the pro ring, because at that time, he had 5 wins and 7 losses. Nevertheless, he was able to test the newcomer. When the sparring began, Weil and Charlie Goldman thought that the letter of Eli Colombo, in which he described Marciano as a future champion, was either some kind of joke or that wonderful boxer from the letter just did not reach them. Al Weil and I used to watch a lot of rookies who thought they could be boxers. But I'd eat my hat if I saw anyone who was as inept and gaunt as Rocky Marciano. He was so clumsy and awkward that we watched him spar and laughed. He didn't stand correctly. He didn't punch correctly. He didn't know how to block punches. He didn't know how to do anything at all. But then all of a sudden, he hit Chansey with an accurate right hook, and he went down. That's when I told Weil that maybe I could make something out of this guy. Before we move on, we need to talk briefly about a guy like Weil Goldman. The former was a manager, the latter a coach. Weil was born in France in 1893, and Goldman was born in Poland in 1887. Despite working together, they were radically opposite people. Weil was vain, rude, harsh, arrogant. In private conversations, he spoke disrespectfully of blacks and generally treated black boxers with disdain, although he often worked with them, including people like Joe Louis. Weil had big connections in the boxing business, which we will also talk about, but a little later. Charlie Goldman was the opposite. He was quiet and humble, a very pleasant and kind man that anyone would want to be friends with and work with. Goldman claims to have about 400 fights to his credit. However, only 165 are officially documented, of which he won 98, 36 of which he lost, and the rest were draws, either by judge's decision or they were fights with the formula, when you can win only by knockout, and if the boxers go the whole distance, then regardless of how the fight was formed, a draw is declared. That's why boxers of the first half of the 20th century have so many draw results. Despite their different personalities, Weil and Goldman were the perfect duo needed to breed champions. Goldman was a great trainer and teacher, while Weil was a manager with unlimited possibilities. Despite Charlie Goldman's optimism, though tempered, but still optimistic, Al Weil thought that it was hardly worth it to pin high hopes on the almost 25-year-old newcomer to pro boxing. Al sent Marciano back to his native land. He negotiated with promoters from the city of Providence, Rhode-Land, that Rocky began to put in boxing nights, which were held there. Providence was only 50 kilometers from Brockton. It was convenient for Rocky. By the way, Providence is known not only for the fact that Rocky Marciano started his career there, but also for the fact that in 1980 in this city was born Puerto Rican boxer Miguel Cotto. On July 12, 1948, in the city of Providence, Rocky Marciano made his pro boxing debut. His opponent in the fight was a native of the Armenian family, Rutyun Bilozarian. Rocky won by knockout in the first round, and he got $40. That's 10 days of unloading coal. After the fifth fight, Al Weil said something had to be done about the last name. Ring announcers were failing, and the press was spelling Rocky's last name any way they could, Marciano, Marciano. After some thought, it was decided to remove 3 letters in the middle and replace the last letter. So Rocky Marciano was born. The name became easier to pronounce and easier to remember. At the same time, the Italian identity was preserved, which was important for Rocky himself. However, it should be noted that in the States, in the English-speaking environment, the surname is pronounced in their own way, Marciano. The press spoke well of Rocky because he won by knockout, and more often than not, in the first round. After reading the press, Al Weil realized that this guy could really be something, so he started sending Charlie Goldman to Providence to attend the fights. And before the fights, Rocky would come to New York, to Goldman's gym for Charlie to work with him. The first fights Rocky Charlie Goldman recalled with a shudder. In some of those fights, he just didn't know what to do, even though he won all those fights. Sometimes I was scared to watch it because I thought he might get killed. Rocky's boxing theory was like a hockey theory. If you keep throwing the puck towards the goal, it will eventually get there. His theory was simple. The more shots you throw, the better chance you have of winning the fight. He also believed that you get more tired when you miss a punch than when you throw it. All this made Rocky an exciting boxer, which is why he was nicknamed the Brockton Blockbuster. Charlie Goldman decided to utilize Rocky's size in a way that made him even smaller. He instilled Rocky with a style of squatting even lower, making him an awkward opponent to reach down for. Seeing good prospects, Al Weil tried to work Marciano into giving up the services of his friend Eli Colombo, but Rocky replied that would never happen. Ali was there for him from day one, and even quit his job to give Rocky 100% of his time and help his friend launch his boxing career. But that was the thing about Weil. He always wanted sole control over the boxer. Even though Rocky was starting to make more or less good money, and Weil wasn't taking a percentage of his fees yet, Rocky had to cover all of his training expenses on his own. Out of their own pockets, they even paid for trips from Brockton to New York to train at Charlie Goldman's gym. They took the cheapest train tickets, but sometimes they hitchhiked in trucks to save money, and they didn't always ride in the cab. One day, they came in the back of a truck loaded with vegetables. I hope the cabbage they were sitting on didn't look as bad as Rocky and Ellie looked. They looked like garbage collectors. While in New York, Marciano and Colombo rented a room in one of the IMCA chapters, Young Men's Christian Association. It was $1 a night. In the evening, in their free time, they would just stroll down Broadway, looking at the signs and front doors of various night spots. They dreamed of someday being inside. One day on the street, they saw Willie Pep walking along with his girlfriend. Rocky and Ellie watched the world featherweight champion for almost 2 hours. At the time, Rocky had no idea that Willie would become his friend. It was a challenging, yet exciting and heartwarming time. Two friends with big dreams are trying to conquer the boxing capital of the world, starting from the bottom. While the center of their boxing world was not 8 million New York, but Providence with 250,000 inhabitants, the state of Rhodiland. And things were going very well there.
He was fighting in Providence. Providence has a tremendous contingent of Italians. And of course, Rocky almost became instantly a cult hero. He is, to this day, they think that he was from Providence.
In March of 1949, Marciano earned $250 for the fight, and there were almost 3,000 spectators in attendance, and it was a breakthrough. Within a year, the attention on Marciano grew. During 1949, in 16 months since his re-debut, Marciano had 21 fights. The fame of the Italian welterweight went far beyond New England and reached New York. Now it's time to take Rocky to the boxing capital of the world. But before we go with Marciano to New York, it is necessary to tell about what it was a period of time. The year 1949 is one of the most important years in the history of world boxing because it was a period of great changes. First of all, at the beginning of the year, Joe Louis, who was the king of super heavyweight since 1937, that is almost 12 years, announced the end of his career. Secondly, the boxing industry in New York has a new master. The time of Mike Jacobs had come to an end. Jacobs was Joe Louis's promoter and was also part of the management of the Madison Square Garden Company, one of the largest entertainment companies in the United States. Jacobs was called the most influential man in boxing in the late 30s and first half of the 40s. Without his approval, in the super heavyweight division, no significant fight could take place. In 1946, Jacobs suffered a stroke and began to gradually retire from the business. Joe Louis, from whom Mike began to squeeze money, broke off relations with him and began working with the new owners of professional boxing. Now, professional boxing in New York was run by IBC, International Boxing Club. The founders were businessman Jim Norris and his companion, Arthur Wirtz. But the main face was Norris. Joe Louis was hired as a consultant, but Joe was more than just a consultant. He was an important part of the game IBC was playing. He was to feign leaving boxing and then return at the right moment to create a big stir. The proc maker for the company was Al Weil, but all of this was just the tip of the iceberg. But there were big and very dangerous sharks swimming under the water. The shadowy head of IBC was a man named Paolo Giovanni, better known as Frankie Carbo. He was born in Sicily in 1904, although some sources state that he was born in the U.S., but he was transported to the U.S. at an early age. He led an unlaw-abiding life from childhood and was sent to a juvenile detention center as early as 11 years old. Until the age of 20, Carbo made regular trips to detention centers, mostly for theft. But when he was 20, he shot and killed a cab driver, and at his trial, he claimed he was extorting money from him, and it was self-defense. He eventually pleaded guilty and got 4 years in prison. However, he served only 1 year and 8 months in prison. After being released, Frankie got a job, which at the time could not be found in the newspaper in the job section. He became a hitman. It was the dangerous 1920s and the Prohibition period. And as a consequence, the underground alcohol business began to grow. The struggle for spheres of influence led to the fact that underground businessmen turned to mercenaries to eliminate competitors. In 1929, representatives of the Italian and Jewish Mafia of the USA formed a national crime syndicate. This was done as part of a strategy to develop an underground alcohol empire. A subdivision of the syndicate became the Murder Corporation. The task of this organization was to eliminate competitors. During the 12 years of its existence, the Murder Corporation accounted for about 1,000 eliminations, and one of the main actors in this bloody business was Frankie Carbo. For 10 years of hard work in the corporation, he was arrested 17 times on suspicion of murder, and in 5 cases, he was even brought formal charges. But for lack of hard evidence, he was released each time. In 1939, Carbo shot Harry Greenberg, who was a member of the Jewish Mafia. But then it turned out that he was leaking information to the police, for which he was eliminated by his own associates. 2 years after Greenberg's murder, Frankie Carbo was arrested, and 2 of his former Homicide Corporation partners volunteered as witnesses in the case and were willing to testify against Carbo. However, witness number 1, Abraham Rellis, who was under guard at the hotel, somehow miraculously fell out of a window. Witness 2, Albert Tannenbaum, avoided falling out of the window, but at the trial, he did not provide any substantive information regarding Carbo, and the court simply did not accept his testimony, and Frankie avoided jail for the umpteenth time. In 1941, the Murder Corporation ceased to exist. First of all, a number of the most active members were arrested, and secondly, Prohibition was abolished, and the Mafia was busy making sure that the whole alcohol business was legalized. And they had already killed everyone they could kill. Thanks to his ruthlessness, performance, and fanatical devotion, Frankie Carbo enjoyed great prestige and eventually rose to very high positions in the criminal hierarchy. He became a member of the Italian-American criminal structure of New York under the name of 5 Families, which exists and successfully operates until now. In his new status, Carbo went to conquer new territories, in particular California, where he became interested in professional boxing. And then he met a promoter named Blinky Palermo, who was a member of the Italian criminal structure, bisected in St. Louis. Palermo quickly became an associate of Frankie Carbo. In the mid-40s, Carbo's ambitions became cramped in California, and he decided it was time to return to New York, where the biggest money revolved. Here let's remember that in 1946, the main man in professional boxing, Mike Jacobs, had a stroke, and somehow he quickly withdrew from his business and sold his business for only $100,000. And for Mike, that's a ridiculous amount of money. Jacobs' stroke came after threats and an assassination attempt. And it all looks like Frankie Carbo's work. Rumor has it that Frankie came to Jacobs and offered to work together, but Mike turned him down. After that, Frankie resorted to his usual methods of problem solving. Once, the most influential man in the boxing business became a puppet in the hands of a criminal mastermind, who gradually entered the industry, and in 1947 organized a fake fight with James LaMotta, who was offered to lose the fight to Billy Fox in exchange for a title fight in the future. Also involved in the story was one of boxing's most beloved fighters, Gus Lesnovich. The story didn't come out publicly until 1970 when LaMotta testified during a court hearing. But still, it will have to be repeated in order to have a full picture of the situation and understanding of the current story. I received an offer of $100,000 to lose to Billy Fox, and I turned it down. I said I was only interested in championship fights. I was told it could be arranged. A championship fight could be made. I heard that for a couple weeks. While I was training, I got injured, I went to the doctor to have it checked out, and it turns out I had a problem with my spleen. And he said I couldn't fight. But I said I'd still fight. But eventually, I realized that I couldn't win the fight. And that's when I told them I was going to lose to Billy Fox. If I was guaranteed a world championship fight. In the late 40s, at the same time as Frankie Carbo started to enter the boxing business in New York, Jim Norris appeared on the scene, who inherited his father's multi-million-dollar empire and decided to invest in a very lucrative business called professional boxing. The problem was that people in the boxing world were used to living by the old rules, and some daddy's boy with his ambition is not an option. Norris bought up all the contracts with TV channels, radio stations, and commissions, but boxers' managers were not willing to work with Norris, who declared himself in IBC as the new commander-in-chief of New York boxing. The situation was this: if you want to box and have a chance at the title, you have to become a client of IBC on the company's terms. And if it does not like the boxer's manager, for example, then the boxer must refuse him. Naturally, from such a prospect of being out of work, many managers simply closed access to their boxers. Part of the reason Norris found himself at a dead end, he bought the whole industry, but there was no one to work in it. A significant portion of the ranking boxers were out of reach. Norris did not know what to do with this problem until he had a new acquaintance, who for an unofficial share in the business promised to solve everything very quickly. I think you guessed that it was Frankie Carbo. At the time, many wondered how could not just get close on the basis of business, but to become friends, coming from a very wealthy family, Jim Norris and former assassin Francie Carbo. But those who knew Norris said that Jim always admired people from the criminal world and their ability to quickly and effectively achieve the desired goal without unnecessary bureaucracy. Norris and Carbo built a principle of work, which people from the outside called utilitarian. Utilitarianism is a trend in ethics that states that the moral value of an act is determined by its utility. In other words, it does not matter by what methods you achieve your goal. The main thing is the result that will bring you pleasure. More specifically, a lot of money. Carbo created a well-organized, centralized system of control over boxing. In this system, there were many managers who acted as Carbo's front men. As soon as a promising fighter appeared on the scene, one of Carbo's managers became the owner of his career. Fear and violence were the backbone of Carbo's system and the basis of his power. Directly or indirectly, he controlled a multitude of referees, officials, managers, promoters, and fighters. Carbo's power became such that no major fight was made or championship title awarded without his consent. And thus a new era in boxing was ushered in. Since 1949, the sport has been under the control of criminals. At first glance, everything is clean. Millionaire and businessman Jim Norris and his company IBC work officially, strictly under contract, but everyone knew that this is only the visible part. But in the shadows, having the greatest influence hid the godfather of boxing, Frankie Carbo. And the most important thing for our story is that Frankie Carbo's confidant was Al Weil, machinist for IBC and the Madison Square Garden Arena, as well as manager of Rocky Marciano. Given the shared Italian ancestry of Carbo and Marciano, it is not surprising that Frankie took an interest in Rocky's career and instructed him to make him fight at Madison Square Garden. December 2, 1949, Rocky Marciano, just a year ago, went to the boxing gym in a van truck, sitting in the middle of the cabbage, came into the ring of the main boxing arena of those years. His opponent was the declining Pep Richards, but this fight was made just for Rocky to win by knockout, which he did in the second round. In the main event that night, another native of an Italian migrant family, Roland LaStarza, fought in the main event. Ultimately, Carbo's plan was to pit Marciano and LaStarza against each other. In addition to the changes I've outlined, there was one other thing that happened. Joe Luis completed his career, or rather pretended to complete it. But we'll come back to that. And the new super heavyweight champion was a boxer who avoided attention, did not crave fame, and unlike most people, did not seek friendship with influential people like Frankie Carbo. He just got in the ring and did his job. The amazing thing is that the new king of the super heavyweight division was a middleweight. I think a lot of you know who we're talking about. It was Ezzard Charles, nicknamed Cobra, from Cincinnati. Ezzard, like many of his colleagues, was under contract with IBC because he was previously under contract with Jacobs. Then Jacobs gave those contracts to Joe Louis, and Louis sold those contracts to IBC. Carbo and Norris were not thrilled with the new champion because the technical and rarely give a toss about the diminutive Charles after the giant knockout artist Luis was not very popular with the fans. If you have watched the 100th episode titled The Greatest Boxer in History, then you know this personality in detail. If you haven't, then you should watch it. Meanwhile, just 4 weeks after making his debut at Madison Square Garden with an interim stop in the form of a fight in Providence, Marciano stepped back into the ring in New York. The opponent was Carmine Wingo. Marciano dropped him in the first round, then dropped him in the second round. But in that second round, Wingo got up after the fall and managed to shake Rocky. It was a hard, grueling fight. In the sixth round, Marciano sent his opponent to a knockout. Wingo fell down and lost consciousness. When he was taken to the hospital, his condition was assessed as serious. The chances of survival were 50-50. However, after a few days, Wingo started to come back to life. For Marciano, who was in Brockton and literally depressed, this was some of the best news of his life. Even though Marciano was far from being considered wealthy, he paid for Wingo's treatment, paying $2,500, which was the majority of his savings. Wingo eventually recovered, though not completely. He remained partially paralyzed on his left side. However, this did not prevent him from leading a full life, although he was understandably done with boxing. Carmine is my friend. He forgave me. If he hadn't, I probably wouldn't have been able to continue my boxing career. On March 24, 1950, two undefeated boxers, Rocky Marciano and LaStarza, met at the Madison Square Garden arena. This fight was presented as a fight, the winner of which will become a title challenger. Considering that already 2 years there were active preparations for the return of Joe Louis and rumors about it leaked to the press, the interest in the Marciano-LaStarza fight was considerable. At the MSG Arena gathered almost 14,000 spectators that brought $53,000. LaStarza's fee amounted to a record for him $13,000. Marciano received $8,000, and it was also the largest fee in his career at that time. For understanding, the average annual income per family in 1950 in the United States was $3,300. Record of the fight is absent, and it was the hardest for Rocky in his career at that time and ambiguous. LaStarza is an agile counterpunching boxer. Such opponents have always been uncomfortable for Rocky. Nevertheless, in the fourth round, Marciano managed to send LaStarza to knockdown. Although then knockdowns did not have such a significant meaning as they do now. In the eighth round, Marciano was taken down 1 point for strikes below the belt. When the 10-round fight was over, the judges decided 5-4 in favor of Marciano, 5-4 in favor of LaStarza, and the third 5-5 a draw. However, the organizers of the fight were not satisfied with this result, and they applied an approach in which the outcome of a draw fight is decided by the referee. The referee gave the victory to Marciano. The fact that Rocky's manager Al Whale is a matchmaker for MSG suggests that this influenced the decision in favor of Marciano, which was extremely strange. I won that fight. Everybody but the ref saw that. All members of the press gave the fight to me. LaStarza is exaggerating, of course. Not all the press gave him the win, but most of them. But he still had reason to be angry. As for the knockdown, according to those rules, points for knockdown were not taken off. The round simply went to the one who knocked down the opponent with a standard score of 1-0. When the referee deducts points for an infringement of the rules, the referees are obliged to deduct points. That's why another very strange circumstance is the card of referee Jack Watson, who gave the score 5-5. Supervisor, for some reason, did not deduct 1 point from Marciano. I recall that in the case of a tied round put 0-0. So there is no way a boxer can have more than 5 points in a 10-round fight when the overall score is tied. That is, on the Watson card, taking into account that Marciano was taken off 1 point, should be not 5-5, but 5-4 in favor of LaStarza. And then Roland would have won the fight without having to resort to a referee's opinion. But Watson's bizarre card and the referee's controversial decision that only gave LaStarza 3 rounds was the second indication that Rocky was taken in stride and had staked the championship race on him. You're probably thinking right now, when was the first testimonial? You'll find out in a few minutes. Let me remind you that the winner of the Marciano-LaStarza fight was called the challenger for the title held by Ezzard Charles. But Charles is not LaStarza. He is a much higher class boxer. So all talk of a title fight for Rocky faded very quickly. LaStarza was eager to get justice and said he wanted a rematch. Marciano also wanted to face LaStarza a second time and put an end to the controversy, in part because articles like this appeared in the press. Headline: Rocky's shortcomings showed in his split decision victory over LaStarza. Headline: the fight that was expected to give us a world title contender against Ezzard Charles ended up being a stalemate. Naturally, Rocky's desire to fight LaStarza a second time was also influenced by articles stating that Marciano received a gift from the judges that night. But despite the desire of 2 boxers to get in the ring against each other once again, IBC decided that it is not worth to test fate once again and decided to shield Marciano from strong opponents and give him a bag of outsiders to eat. In his next fight, Marciano faced Eldridge Eatman, who had 22 wins and 20 losses, and who ended his career after losing 7 of his last 8 fights. Eatman wasn't just pulled out of retirement. He lost his last fight to LaStarza, but lost by decision. And if Rocky knocks him out, that's some argument. Marciano knocked out Eatman in the 3rd round. This win kicked off a period of his career that is never mentioned in documentaries about Marciano. This is what Rocky's list of opponents looked like over the next year after the controversial fight with LaStarza. Mind you, Marciano was already one of the top 10 super heavyweights. None of these boxers have ever been in the top 10 super heavyweights. True, there is one man here who deserves some special attention. Ted Lowry is a very good boxer who had all the chances to at least fight for the world title, but had no team, so he was not allowed to realize his talent. Marciano met him twice. The first fight took place back in 1949 in Providence. Lowry already had 124 fights on his record. Even by the standards of those years, he was a veteran. Prior to his first meeting with Marciano, Lowry had won only 3 of his last 20 fights, although he had been robbed several times. In the 1st and 4th rounds of the fight against Lowry, Marciano was nearly knocked out. Rocky lost the first 4 rounds out of 10 because there was no way he could recover from the heavy punches he missed in the 1st round. Lowry then went into cautious mode, slowing down and working on counterpunching. This gave Rocky a chance to gradually recover, and he was pretty aggressive in the last 3 rounds, although he looked very tired. There were no judges in that fight, and the result was decided by the referee, and without a count. He was just saying, "This boxer won," and he gave the victory to Marciano, who for half of the fight walked in a state of grogginess and could not shake his opponent once. Rocky already had the support of the fans in Providence at the time, but even they disapproved when they heard the decision. Rocky Marciano did not win that fight. Marciano was on the verge of losing by knockout in the 1st and 4th rounds, but then Lowry buckled down. A lot of people seemed to think he was feeling sorry for Marciano. Maybe he was being bribed, maybe he was just saving his energy. Marciano was able to pull himself together in the final rounds, although he missed a lot and his punches lacked power. Most observers thought Lowry won the fight.
What I would say, probably you wouldn't like, I thought I beat him. But his name was bigger than my name, you know? And so naturally, I guess they gave it to him, you know? But you'd have to ask someone that was there and saw the fight what they thought, you know? I'm the only man who went the distance with him twice, too. Never got knocked down or anything, you know?
Lowry was a boxer who stylistically could be compared to LaStarza, Joe Walcott Jersey, and most importantly, Ezzard Charles. Therefore, in November 1950, Marciano and Lowry met again so that Marciano's company could evaluate how much their boxer added against technical and mobile opponents. Lowry already had 138 fights under his belt. Marciano won the second fight fairly, rather not because he himself seriously improved, but because Lowry gave up. Rocky still won with difficulty. The beginning of the fight was again for Lowry. Ted just didn't have enough strength and stamina. From the fourth round, Rocky took the initiative and took the fight to a decision victory. The old problems didn't go away. Rocky didn't know what to do with moving boxers. If a battered Laurie could stump Marciano, it's probably too early to think about a fight against Ezzard Charles, who also gave IBC a lot of trouble in 1950. And that was something that nobody in the company expected. As I said, in early 1949, Joe Louis announced his retirement from boxing. Then it turned out that Jim Norris and Frankie Carbo paid him $150,000 to step aside for a while, and then come back when they tell him to. Louis left, although he wasted no time. He held exhibition fights, which turned into exhibition beatings. Louis spared no one, and many of his exhibition fights ended with him knocking out his opponents. Like I said, Charles was an uncomfortable champion. He won and dominated, but not as flashy as Joe Louis did in the 30s or 40s. Charles was a filigree boxer, and he was a super heavyweight, so it was unrealistic to expect him to be a meat grinder and a hard-hitting knockout artist. But that's exactly what the public wanted. He was a moneymaker, but not as much as IBC wanted from a super heavyweight champion. So it was arranged that Joe Louis would come back to the ring and beat Charles and then face Marciano. You may have already learned from the movie The Greatest Boxer in History that Charles-Louis fight was probably the greatest masterclass in boxing history. Ezzard retained the title, and Rocky's entrance to the championship fight had to be postponed again. After the second fight with Laurie, it was obvious that Charles Marciano would not be able to take the fight. But after the beating that Charles gave to Joe Louis, it was possible to start thinking about the Louis Marciano fight. In the meantime, Rocky finally faced a top 10 opponent for the first time in his career. Rex Lane was considered the favorite against Marciano because he had wins over top contenders, including Joe Walcott Jersey. Stylistically, Lane was similar to Marciano. He likes to go forward and chop too, but he only had dynamite in his right hand. Marciano had dynamite in both hands, and Rocky had a stronger inner core, which probably determined the outcome of the fight. Lane just broke under Marciano's punches and went down in the 6th round.
Frame in this scheduled 10-round bout to establish a contender for the heavyweight crown. Lane's tired. He's completely flat-footed now. The cumulative effect of Rocky's punches have brought him to the verge of collapse. Rocky jabs with his left, and here it comes. You'll see Marciano fire a long-range right that stuns Rex Lane, and then he crumples forward to the canvas.
Lane's fall has raised questions for some. Describing the fight, they point to a delayed reaction after a right punch, but with delayed reaction, a boxer usually just goes down, and Lane laid down gently on the canvas and curled up. But in general, it is not so important, as Marciano led on all the judges' cards, and most likely this fight ended anyway in his favor. After 1.5 months, Rocky defeated Freddie Bashir, who was previously defeated by Ezzard Charles. And then a fight was announced for the two main title challengers, Joe Louis versus Rocky Marciano. After losing to Ezzard Charles, Joe Louis decided to try his luck again in the championship race. He won 8 fights in a row and moved up to the top spot on the list of contenders. Louis would have preferred to go out for a title fight, but IBC needed a fight that would seriously raise Rocky's recognition. Marciano had already started to create a positive image in the press. In particular, it wrote that he continues to help Carmine Wingo, who was left partially paralyzed after the fight with Rocky, and that Marciano gave Carmine a share in some business, although then it turned out that none of that was true. Rocky helped a lot when he paid $2,500 for the treatment, but further stories about helping Wingo were just PR and were aimed at creating an image. In addition, Marciano was labeled the new Great White Hope. Back at the turn of the century, black boxers were kept out of title fights, and here blacks have ruled the division for 14 years. Of course, Joe Louis, who took most of that time, had many fans among the white population, but the idea of a white champion, and even with the name of a simple and good guy from a working family, liked the public. October 26, 1951, New York, Madison SQ Garden Arena. The fans were on Louis' side that night because it's about an icon, an idol. I was sitting in the audience, my brother in the ring. But even I sympathized with Joe Louis. Rocky sympathized with Joe Louis. Joe Louis was on a streak of 8 straight wins. The problem is, Joe had those fights in 9 months. That's a very fast pace for a 37-year-old boxer with almost 70 fights under his belt. 9 months of training and fighting with no rest is too much. Joe's overworked himself. He needed a little rest, but Frankie Carbo and Jim Norris couldn't let that happen. They needed Marciano to win. Rocky was going at about the same pace, but he was 9 years younger, and he had half as many fights and easier opponents. So Luis was faced with a fact. It was now or never. Joe, whose money problems were snowballing, had no time for bickering. He agreed to fight without rest. After the fight with Jimmy Bivens, Luis immediately went to training camp because before the fight with Marciano was only 2 and a little months. And now, along with the fight against Marciano, the non-stop stretch was 11 months. It wasn't long ago that Louis himself was made comfortable when he didn't let Ezzard Charles recover to improve Joe's chances. Now it was already Luis himself who was in this uncomfortable position. Marciano was a big fan of Joe Louis, and he said he was the last man on earth he wanted to fight. But the Bomber was the most popular super featherweight of those years, and the path to glory lay through him.
Using throughout the fight. It connects with Joe's ear. Keep watching for that punch. That's the one that spells finish for Louis.
Luis had a good start to the fight. After 4 rounds on 2 cards, the score was 2-2 on 2 cards, and on the third 3-1 in favor of Luis. But then Joe started to run out of steam, and Marciano took control of the fight.
As he's driven back to the ropes, a favorite maneuver of Marciano. One he's been using to good advantage throughout the fight. Marciano exerting more and more pressure as he moves in for the kill. Rocky about to glance a right off Louis' jaw. And see how quickly he moves in, giving Joe no time at all to catch his breath. Now watch this. Marciano's hard left hook sends Louis crawling to the canvas. Another left cripples Louis. A blazing right. And Louis sails through the ropes.
The audience reaction when Joe Louis was knocked out was muted. It was like a silent tribute to the great Joe Louis.
This is the second time in his career he was knocked out.
Rocky earned $44,000 for that fight, with the average income per family in 1951 being $3,700. After coming home, Rocky told his father to quit the factory because he would never have to work again. As for the Marciano-Luis fight, that night, one era finally ended and another began, or rather, was ready to begin. But I had to hold Rocky back a bit because I had to let my partners earn it. By then, Ezzard Charles had lost his title by knockout to Joe Walcott Jersey, who took a year off after the win. Walcott's career was managed by Felix Boquicchio, a big man in the U.S. gambling business and a companion of Frankie Carbo. Carbo and Norris, seemingly concerned for the profits, agreed to wait for Boquicchio to run his scam. Although it was very risky, here's the gist of it. After Walcott took the title from Ezzard Charles, Boquicchio agreed to organize a rematch, but in the state of Pennsylvania. And this is the epicenter of his business. Charles was declared the favorite as he had won 2 of his 3 fights against Walcott, and the victory by knockout Jersey Joe in the 3rd fight was perceived more as luck, so the bulk of the bets were on the victory of Ezzard. However, literally on the day of the fight was made a bet of several $100,000 on the victory of Joe Walcott with odds of 3. When the fight began, it became obvious that Charles was unlikely to win it. The referee constantly interfered with his work and warned him even for those violations that Charles did not commit. In the end, Ezzard still had the advantage and won the fight, but the judges intervened in the case, which gave the victory to Walcott. Having gilded the mystery man who bet on Jersey Joe's victory to the tune of between $500,000 and $1,000, after pulling off a win over Ezzard in every way possible, Jersey Joe was at the disposal of Rocky Marciano. On September 23, 1952, Rocky goes out for his first title fight, and in the first round, he finds himself on the floor for the first time in his career. Challenger got up and continued to pursue his goal. A lot of things didn't work out. Walcott forced his opponent to miss often and counterattacked sharply, and also tried to knit in clinches.
A good right cross, landing suddenly, another left hook. moving to the attack now, taking the play away for the first time from Jersey. Dropped his guard for a moment, and now they begin to slug it out in the corner. Trading blows left and right, a good right cross by Marciano. Walcott was staggered, but he fights right back.
At the end of 12 rounds, Walcott was leading on all three judges' scorecards. Had he even lost the remaining 3 rounds, the fight would have ended in a draw, and Jersey Joe would have retained the title. But
Now begin. And the new heavyweight champion of the world, Rocky Marciano.
Walcott saw perfectly well that Marciano was aiming to the right and he was ready to meet him. But Rocky prepared his attack perfectly and his fist reached the target faster. It was a perfect knockout punch. Rocky Marciano becomes world champion, and the beauty of the moment was enhanced by the fact that immediately after the fight was stopped, the first one who jumped into the ring and hugged Rocky was Eli Colombo, the man who had been by his side the whole time and always believed that together they would get to the top. And they did. 2 guys from a poor Brockton neighborhood made their dreams come true, dreams that sometimes had to ride in the back of a dirty truck. They came to the goal against those predictions from 4 years ago, including the predictions of even those who were now around to say they believed in Rocky from the moment they first saw him. For the most part, that includes Al Weil, who, as we recall, when we first met him, advised Rocky to forget about boxing and go home.
I just say, Rocky, I says, yeah, champ. He says, let's go for a walk. I says, let's go. And Rocky says, Nick, I'm the champ of the world. I said, you're beautiful.
Back home, Rocky organized a trip to Italy for his parents so they could visit their homeland for the first time in over 30 years. He also bought a 9-bedroom house in the upscale Brockton neighborhood. In December 1952, Rocky and his wife Barbara had a daughter, Mary Ann. Rocky Marciano became a hero in which any American could recognize himself.
Celebrities who get caught up in their success. Rocky never really got caught up in it. He actually didn't like it when people fussed over him and told him how great he was. I think this is what separated him from most other athletes, and that was a beautiful thing to see.
A humble but very persistent guy, Rocky really became a hero to people who saw him as more than just a symbol of success. They saw that this success was real and tangible. For all his modesty, Rocky still had a huge inner drive for fame. Therefore, many things from his personal life were in plain sight. A public wedding, information about the birth of a child, about buying a house, about sending his parents to Italy. It was as if Marciano let people into his life. The life of a man who started out in the same position as the vast majority of people in the country. Look what he's accomplished. True, all of this was under the watchful eye and control of Frankie Carbo and his men. But that's something that ordinary people don't need to know. Otherwise, the image would be ruined. After not the easiest victory in his first title fight was the question of choosing the next opponent. And somehow it turned out that the choice was not much, and that's putting it mildly. Logically, it would have been interesting to fight another former champion, Ezzard Charles. But first the defeat and then the robbery against Walcott didn't break Cobra, and he showed very good form. So IBC were still hesitant to put Rocky on it. The most interesting fight from the point of view of money security was the rematch with Walcott. First of all, Rocky would come out on a completely different confidence. Secondly, due to the fact that Jersey Joe won the title at only 5 attempts, and at that time was the oldest champion in history, he had a lot of fans inspired by his story. IBC made an offer to Felix Bocchicchio for a Marciano Walcott rematch. Surprisingly, Bocchicchio and Walcott said no. Out of respect for his partner, Jim Norris started to raise the stakes, and it came to the point that Walcott, who lost the title, was to receive $250,000 and Marciano, the champion, $160,000. To our surprise, Bocchicchio again refused. Then Frankie Carbo got in touch with him and lucidly explained that if Felix and Walcott would not accept the fight, Carbo could remember his youth and influence their determination in various interesting ways. and it was unlikely they would like those ways, refused the former assassin and the most influential man in professional boxing. Boccicchio and Walcott could not. In May 1953, Marciano and Walcott met for the second time, and now to send his opponent to the floor, Rocky needed not 37 minutes as in the first fight, but only 2.5 minutes. Walcott went down, and when the ref counted to 10 and stopped the fight, Jersey Joe got up and started arguing that the ref was counting too fast. Although, as the record shows, the referee did his job perfectly. Given the intimidation from Carbo, the theory that Jersey Joe simply gave up the fight has emerged. After the fight, many fans and members of the press criticized Walcott for his behavior, and some even accused him of just walking out to collect the check. The revenue sharing was very strange. First of all, Marciano was a champion. Secondly, at the time, Marciano was more popular than Walcott, yet he got paid a lot less for the fight. And now Al Weil and IBC have decided to look at Ezzard Charles. 11 days after defeating Walcott in a rematch, Marciano traveled to Milwaukee for a fight between Charles and Larry Watson. Before the fight, Rocky entered the ring to take a picture with his future opponent. Charles won, and in the status of #1 contender, which he was even before the fight with Watson, began to wait for the organization of the fight against Marciano, but he didn't. Team Rocky changed their minds and chose an old acquaintance, Roland LaStarza, who just last fight the judges gave the victory over Rex Lane, and it turned out that it was done for a reason. It's important to note here that Marciano was ready to fight Charles and was confident that Ezzard would be his next opponent, but Al Weil for some reason decided that his time had not yet come. Only signed the fight against LaStarza, he started saying insulting things about Marciano. LaStarza said that Rocky was missing too many punches and his mental skills were suffering. The champ was really pissed off.
LaStarza was still claiming that he had been robbed in their first bout back in 1950. What's more, LaStarza told the press that Rocky had taken too many punches to the head and was punch drunk. This infuriated Rocky.
I believe, to my knowledge, the only time that Rocky went in the ring with personal feelings of animosity was the time that he fought Roland LaStarza, and it was all due to the things that LaStarza said in the media.
Nevertheless, LaStarza promoted the fight well, and 44,000 spectators gathered at the Polo Grounds Arena in New York. Rocky got 185,000 for the fight, while LaStarza got 65,000. After 10 rounds of a tough and competitive fight, one of the cards was a draw, with Marciano leading on the other two. But in round 11, Rocky punished his opponent for his tongue. First, he took him out over the ropes and then forced the ref to step in and stop the fight. Now, except for Ezzard Charles, there are no interesting and money fights left, but it was Ezzard himself, or rather his team, who got greedy and organized him a fight 4 weeks apart against two very dangerous and uncomfortable opponents, and even on the territory of these opponents. One of them was the tall Cuban Nino Valdez, 1.91 meters tall. Valdez was one of the top 3 contenders, and the press has fantasized about a Marciano-Valdez fight. But Rocky's manager Al Weil pretended that Valdez didn't exist. That's not to say the Cuban was a monster, and I personally think Marciano would have beaten him, and early. But it would still be interesting to see him fight Rocky. Valdez deserved it, but it was Charles who was on the docket. Ezzard was the only super heavyweight champion Rocky had yet to fight in the ring. He'd beaten Louis and Walcott. That leaves Charles. But Ezzard lost his last 2 fights, and that's not good for the promotion. Al Weil called Ezzard's manager Jake Means and said that if Charles wins against 2 ranked opponents, he will get a fight with Marciano for 2 months. The condition was met, and in 1 month, Ezzard won both fights by knockout, the second of which was a real masterpiece.
Shot by Justice Lankford. 1, 2, 3, 4.
Then it was announced that on June 17, 1954, Rocky Marciano will hold a 3-title defense against former champion Ezzard Charles. Both boxers received record fees. Marciano, $275,000, Charles, $138,000. 47,000 tickets sold brought in $540,000. In sum, with radio and television, total revenue amounted to almost $850,000. This fight was one of the highest grossing fights in history. The atmosphere before the fight was as friendly as possible. Not the slightest attempt to hurt his opponent. It looked like two longtime friends decided to have a contest. Some of you already know this. Ezzard Charles was fluent in Italian, so he and Marciano could speak in two languages at once, and this attracted the crowd to the fight, especially the Italian-speaking crowd.
Ezzard, why don't you try out your Italian on Rocky?
Okay, sure. Come sta, campione del mundo, esta notte? Molto bene. Che penso te stasera? Stasera è tardi per me. Tardi. Anche io, essere troppo tardi per me.
Rocky had 45 fights on his record, and Charles had 96 fights on his record. The champion was a 4-1 favorite, and naturally everyone expected the already shabby Cobra to be defeated and retired by Brockton Blockbuster, like the other two champions, Lewis and Walcott. However, in reality, it turned out to be more complicated than that. Much more complicated.
Charles scoring repeatedly with good, solid right smashes. Beautiful right uppercut. Rocky's careless. Right on the button. Charles mixing up his leads, first to the body, then to the head.
For the first 5 rounds, the audience watched a boxing masterclass performed by Ezzard Charles. Marciano looked as if he had not learned anything at all during the previous 6 years in pro boxing. Unbeknownst to you, you wouldn't know that Marciano is the reigning champion, more like an accidental challenger in a championship fight. After a fast start, Charles started to save his energy because only the third part of the fight was behind him. It was easier for Marciano to approach and attack. Nevertheless, it was possible to develop success only at the expense of prolonged attacks, and Rocky missed a lot. Surprisingly, after 10 rounds, Charles was still leading on the judges' scorecards, but Rocky was still seriously cracking his opponent. In 12-13 rounds, there was a feeling that Marciano will win in the most traditional style, losing he will rake and knock out his opponent. But in the 14th round, Charles went on the counterattack. Rocky himself had a hard time here. The fight, contrary to most predictions, went the whole distance. And it would be naive to believe that Ezzard Charles has a chance to favor the judges. They gave the victory to Marciano. However, after the fight, the press, and in general, the entire boxing community spoke not about the current champion, but about the former champion. Everyone in the boxing community agrees that Ezzard Charles was the big winner in the 15-round fight against Rocky Marciano. It was one of the greatest fights in the super heavyweight division. Without belittling the champion, it has to be said that this fight became such because of Ezzard Charles. In the fight with Ezzard Charles, I learned what real pain is. So commented on this confrontation Rocky himself. And here is what said the former opponent of both boxers, Joe Louis. I think Ezzard Charles won the fight. Louis claimed that Charles won the fight by a score of 8-6 in a 1-round draw. That was probably the most accurate assessment of the fight. But Marciano was too big a star to be beaten by a 1-2 point advantage, and to rely on the objectivity of the judges. Of course, there were those who thought that Rocky won deservedly. But in any case, this story went to the piggy bank of questionable victories in Rocky's career. From a business standpoint, it's nothing new or shocking. The reigning champion and the biggest boxer of our time in one person will always have a few points advantage even before the fight, which in addition organized by the people who manage the career of this champion. They didn't put their money into him for nothing. They wanted to make even more money, and to do that, they had to make sure Marciano won. And they had no doubt that when Rocky got in the ring, he would do everything in his power. And what doesn't depend, such as the judge's decision, can always be tweaked. The confrontation between Marciano and Ezzard Charles is another topic that is bypassed in documentaries about Rocky. It usually looks like this. There was Ezzard Charles. Rocky beat him by decision. That's it. Although it was one of the most dramatic and entertaining fights in boxing history. And Charles is one of the top 10 greatest boxers in history, regardless of weight class. Defeating such a boxer is a milestone in Rocky's career, and it's strange to talk about it less than the fight with the same LaStarza, who even many boxing fans have never heard of. But given Rocky's super positive image, it is probably uncomfortable to talk about the fact that he received gifts thanks to his influential promoters from the criminal world. And the topic of controversial fights, and the fact that the godfather of Marciano's career was a former mercenary Frank Carbo prefer to mention momentarily or not to mention at all. The Marciano family vehemently denies that Rocky had any ties to the Mafia, but at the same time it is a well-known fact. The 50s are the years when crime had maximum influence in professional boxing, and no title fight in the super heavyweight division was held without Carbo's approval. This was proven in court hearings, and Carbo got a huge prison sentence for it. And it was the 50s that were Rocky Marciano's championship years. It's not about Rocky doing any dark deeds, although he did try to avoid paying taxes. But we'll come back to that topic. It's about the fact that Rocky Marciano is not a Terminator who destroyed everyone in his path. In his career, there are very controversial fights in which the scales were tipped to his side not by skill, character, or will to win, but by the fact that he was Italian at the time when boxing was run by another Italian, who held a high position in the Italian-American Mafia system. Rocky, like Dempsey and Louis before him, Ali and Tyson and Mayweather after him, was part of big business. And that business benefited from him winning, even if they had to manipulate the results to do it. But one thing is certain, Rocky gave it his all in his fights, and that's important to mention. The fight with Ezzard Charles was the most difficult of Marciano's career, but one of the most spectacular. The rematch was scheduled for September 1953, exactly 3 months after the fight. Considering it was a tough first fight, it was too soon. It was done in order to prevent the already seriously worn-out Charles from recovering. Naturally, the much fresher Marciano will recover much faster. In fact, that's exactly what happened. Charles won the first round and then looked as if he had aged 5 years in a minute. However, in the 6th round, when the end was near, the drama happened. Charles managed to cut Marciano's nose with an uppercut. So, with such an injury, Rocky could hardly make it to the 15th round. It's often said that the dissection was an elbow strike, but Angelo Dundee, Muhammad Ali's trainer, was at that fight. He claims he saw the episode very well. There was an uppercut. Charlie Goldman's trainer told his boxer that if he didn't knock his opponent out in the next couple rounds, the referee would likely stop the fight. On one hand, Goldman was right, but on the other, there were literally millions of dollars bet on Marciano's victory, and the ref knew it very well. If referee Al Burrell had taken Marciano out of the fight, Burrell, would have been drowned in the navigable East River. Fortunately for Burrell, Rocky saved his life. He knocked out Ezzard Charles in the 8th round, although his last punch was to the back of the head. After this victory, Rocky took a break. The #1 contender was Cuban Nino Valdez, but Al Weil wasn't thrilled about fighting a 1.91-meter tall opponent, and Valdez was once again ignored. Instead, Rocky faced #2 contender Don Cockle of Great Britain and defeated him by knockout in the 9th round. The fight was notable for the fact that Rocky had more problems than expected, and also for the fact that Al Weil quietly underestimated Marciano's fee by $10,000 and put that money in his pocket, which Rocky found out about, but much later. It was the autumn of 1955. It had been 3 years since Marciano had been champion. He had only fought 6 fights. That means Rocky fought very rarely in those days, 2 fights a year. Ezzard Charles had 10 championship fights in 2 years. Joe Louis had a stretch when he had 7 title fights in 7 months. Rocky's management treated him with care. His career was built in the style of Jack Dempsey's career, who generally had 8 championship fights in 8 years. Marciano only fought when it was most profitable, but after 6 title fights, there was a vacuum. There were no big super featherweight champions left, and there was basically no one left to make the big fight. Marciano reached a level where he could make more money with any opponent than any other boxer. But Carbo and Norris didn't want to waste it. Besides, there was a very good reason not to waste it, but more on that later. It wasn't the first time the light heavyweight champion Archie Moore challenged Marciano. Al Weil rejected the idea. Moore was already over 40 years old. Weil didn't believe the public would be interested in a fight against the old mongoose. But Moore's manager Bob Reese did. Reese printed over 500 letters and sent them to all major sports publications, informing them that a fight between the two champions would soon take place. Then he organized a poll among more than 1,000 columnists whether they were interested in this fight. Almost 90% said yes. The results were sent to sports publications. After that, Reese printed a poster like this, on which was written, "A reward has been announced for the capture and delivery of Rocky Marciano to any ring in the world to defend his championship belt against the most logical challenger Archie Moore. The reward is for the boxing public to see a great fight and the crowning of a new champion. Any questions, please contact Sheriff Archie Moore." The advertising campaign cost a whopping $50,000 for those years. It was a very clever idea, you'll agree, but Al Weil was adamant, even as the hype mounted. Then Moore went for a truly bold move. When Marciano picked a fight against Don Cockle, who was ranked second on the list of contenders, Archie Moore faced #1 contender Nino Valdez. Moore won by judges' decision and became the mandatory challenger for the super heavyweight title. Now, ignoring Moore would be kind of weird. First, the publicity campaign performed by his manager Bob Reese has borne fruit. Secondly, words were backed up and reinforced by deeds. Not wanting to fight Archie Moore, even if it was 41 years old, would have looked like concrete avoidance. It's unlikely that played any part, though. The main thing was that Al Weil and company IBC saw that there was a very good money to be made on the fight. Weil and Carbo consulted and agreed to the Marciano-Moore fight. But suddenly, out of nowhere, the New York State Athletic Commission made a statement that Archie Moore is obliged to make a defense of his light heavyweight title, and the fight has 40 days to go. It was bad news for Moore because he had just spent in the super heavyweight division and was preparing to make another appearance there against Marciano, and here he needs to lose 10 pounds for the fight, which will take place in a little over a month. And then he's going to gain weight again and take on Marciano. Needless to say, Weil, Carbo, and IBC had close ties to the New York Athletic Commission. The NYC Commission never once made Rocky Marciano fight the #1 contender in 3 years. Marciano only fought whoever the IBC picked. But suddenly, in the run-up to the Marciano-Moore fight, the old mongoose is forced to make a defense, threatening to forfeit his title. Surprisingly, Moore lost the weight in time and had a successful defense. Do you think 41-year-old Archie was given time to rest? Of course not. Here's what it all looked like. May 2nd, 1955. Archie Moore holds a fight in the super heavyweight and immediately learns that in 40 days until June 22nd, he must return to the welterweights and at the same time need to lose 10 kilos. Simply put, IBC with the help of the New York Athletic Commission decided to exhaust Moore, making him jump in categories, and in the shortest possible time. In 4 months, 41-year-old Archie Moore made 2 weight category jumps. When Roy Jones went super heavyweight and then went super heavyweight, he said he needed to take a year-long vacation to recover fully. And Roy was 35 years old. Grandpa Moore, after his extreme weight training after the June fight, was not given any recovery time at all. Archie has only 3 months to make weight first and do it smoothly, and then prepare for the fight. Why so clearly defend a young super heavyweight in his prime against a 41-year-old welterweight with 176 fights to his credit, you ask? Remember, I talked about one good reason that made IBC look for Marciano to fight a money fight, yet not dangerous. The reason was that Rocky was thinking about ending his career. Globally, there were 4 reasons. The first was family. In 1954, due to training, fighting, filming, and appearing on various shows, Rocky was only home 5 months out of 12. His wife Barbara was not happy with this, and the relationship between the couple became strained.
Rocky had a wonderful relationship, with his wife Barbara, but I think they kind of grew in different directions at some point in time. However, Rocky being again with the Italian background, Catholic background, the marriage stayed together. They tried to make it work.
is that Marciano wanted to leave at his peak. 2 hard fights against Ezzard planted a seed of doubt in him about his abilities. The third was that Marciano found that he no longer burned with boxing the way he used to. Hard training is turning into a chore that doesn't bring as much joy and pleasure as it did a few years ago. We'll talk about the fourth reason, probably the most important, closer to the finale.
It's been a long time. At last we're going to get together and we're going to make a terrific fight. It's going to be probably the greatest fight in the last 50 years. And we'll draw a lot of money, give the people a lot of entertainment, but I do expect to win your title.
Archie Moore, you certainly have created a lot of interest in this fight. I'm so glad the match is made, and I'll be ready on September 20th for the fight of my life.
This was the highest grossing fight since the end of World War II. It grossed over $2 million. Both boxers received record fees for themselves. Moore, $240,000. Marciano, $480,000. The average annual income per family in the U.S. in 1955 was $4,400. As you can see, the $50,000 invested by Archie Moore's manager in promotion paid off. The fight was scheduled for September 20th, but on that day, a hurricane blew through New York and the fight was postponed to the next day. In the second round, the entire management of IBC became uncomfortable. Moore knocked Marciano down. While the old mongoose was fresh, he created problems for the champion with his attacks, but his stamina after jumping on the scales was enough only for 5 rounds. Then Moore slumped, and Marciano took control of the fight. He dropped Archie 4 times. The last fall was in the 9th round. That's when the fight was stopped. Rocky Marciano defended his title for the 6th time.
Well, I think we have, gentlemen, I would like to announce my retirement from boxing at this time. Why? Why? Because of my family, wife, daughter, and my folks. I promised my wife that I would retire before the month of May arrived. We were on a vacation in South America when I made that promise. When I retire, Nat, I will definitely try to stay retired. I like to profit by others' mistakes, and if Joe Louis couldn't make a successful comeback, I will not try it.
Another factor in favor of ending his career was when Rocky found out about the $10,000 theft. His manager Al Weil was already taking 50% of Rocky's income, although it wasn't so much Weil as it was IBC. Imagine IBC getting money from TV stations, radio stations, sponsors, ticket sales, and then with the help of Al Weil, it took another 50% of Marciano's fees, and not only from fights, but also from participation in various TV shows. When Rocky found out that Al had stolen $10,000, he decided he'd had enough. He was making a lot of money anyway, of course, but he had made millions over the years with IBC. On the other hand, if it wasn't for IBC, Carbo, Norris, and Weil, would Rocky have had such a successful career? I think we can give an unequivocal answer. No, he would not have. Nevertheless, Rocky left saying he wouldn't be back. But 3 years after the end of his career, he still tried to come back. In June 1959, Swede Jungamar Johansson knocked out Floyd Patterson. Rocky was at that fight and modestly entered the ring. He said nothing and made no complaints. After that, he made the decision to come back, but without publicity.
And try to get myself in condition again as I once did, but I just couldn't. I didn't have the same feeling. I didn't have the same hunger, and for other reasons, I just couldn't concentrate on boxing as I once did. And so I thought it best not to have any publicity on it, but just to go home and call it another day.
There was a story that the alleged Marciano-Johansson fight was thwarted by Floyd Patterson's trainer and manager Cass D'Amato, thanks to a well-drafted contract, and Johansson had to rematch Patterson instead of fighting Marciano. Remember when I said there were 4 reasons why Rocky retired from boxing? and 4 probably carried the most weight. Let me remind you, Rocky retired from boxing very early, at the age of 32. IBC, the company that handled Marciano's career back in 1954, came under investigation for its activities in the sports business. Everyone knew exactly who was in charge of the company, but getting close to Frankie Carbo was not so easy. Nevertheless, in 1955, the court gave Jim Norris and his partner Arthur Wirtz 5 years to sell 40% of IBC shares. In other words, the company should have new shareholders influencing management and decision-making. Exactly 1 year after the court decision, IBC's influence began to decline. Attempts to get close to Frankie Carbo by government agencies intensified, and Rocky Marciano announced his retirement from boxing. There was another detail. Rocky Marciano received a large portion of his fees in cash and did not pay taxes, which could have been a problem if Rocky had been brought in to investigate Frankie Carbo, Blinky Palermo, and IBC. Like, for example, Jake LaMotta was brought in, who admitted at the meeting that he was bribed by Carbo through Palermo and turned in one of his fights. Maybe it's just a coincidence that Rocky left at that exact moment, and it has nothing to do with the fact that IBC's operations have faltered. But honestly, it's hard to believe that Rocky didn't take into account his promoter's obvious legal problems and his own tax evasion when he made the decision to end his career. Who knew how all of this could have ended? Better to step aside early. However, there was a wind of change in boxing, and the days of criminals doing whatever they want are rapidly coming to an end. Regarding the Johansson fight, if Marciano had met him, it would have been in late 1959. At that point, Frankie Carbo was already under investigation and things were bad, because the feds had nailed him for being a promoter without a license. Marciano, as he said himself, interrupted training because there was no previous feelings and the same excitement. It so happened that all this coincided with the fact that it became clear that Frankie Carbo walked free left not long. In late 1959, Carbo was sent to prison for 2 years for conducting promotional activities without a license, but he got out a year later. But in 1961, Frankie was sent back to prison, now for 25 years, for extortion and manipulation of the boxing business. But after 14 years, in mid-1975, he was released due to ill health. Carbo was free for a little over a year and died in November 1976 at the age of 72. In 1967, Rocky Marciano returned to the ring, but virtually. Radio host Murray Warner proposed the idea of computerized fights between champions of different years. A virtual tournament in the format of elimination fights was proposed. The starting pairs won 8 of the finals looked like this. Information on each boxer was loaded into the computer, Daksha 15, and it produced the result that the finalists of the tournament would be Jack Dempsey and Rocky Marciano. The winner of the final was Rocky. In 1968, organizer Murray Warner presented Marciano with a Diamond Championship belt worth $10,000. However, soon with this belt, Rocky had to part with it of his own free will, but for a sad reason. Just a couple months after Marciano won the title of Virtual Champion of all champions, he learned that his former opponent was seriously ill. It was Ezzard Charles. Rocky sold the belt for $10,000 and gave the money to Ezzard's family. Marciano was the first to come to the former champion's aid. Participation in this virtual tournament led to even bigger events. Muhammad Ali was so outraged that he lost to Jim Jeffries in the 1-4 finals that he sued the organizers for $1 million for name damage. Murray Warner settled the matter by paying Ali $10,000. He also offered to arrange a virtual Ali Marciano fight with a showing in movie theaters, and Ali himself would get a share of the sales. Muhammad took the $10,000, calmed down, and agreed. In early August 1969, Muhammad Ali and Rocky Marciano met in the shooting ring. They practiced different variations of the development of their confrontation, as well as different outcomes of the fight. In total, they practiced 75 rounds. When everything was filmed from the available footage, edited 2 versions of the fight. The premiere in theaters was held on January 20th, 1970. In the US was shown a version in which the knockout in the 13th round won Marciano. Images of this version of the outcome you see at the moment. The second version was for Europe, and Ali won because Marciano was unable to continue the fight due to dissections. The screening of the fight in cinemas in the US and Europe brought in $5 million. Sometime later, Ali again expressed his dissatisfaction and said that he would sue. Although he has already received a fee for participating in this project, it was agreed that all recordings of this staged battle would be destroyed. As you can see, if something was destroyed, then obviously not everything. But Rocky Marciano did not see the video of his virtual victory over Muhammad.
And there was a news flash that said, heavyweight champion from Massachusetts killed in a plane crash. Immediately, the blood rushed to my head. I stood up and I screamed.
3 weeks after filming, on August 31st, 1969, the day before his 46th birthday, Rocky died in a plane crash. At 6 p.m., Rocky and his acquaintance named Frankie Farrell, also known as...
I just remember getting the phone call and going to my mom's and her. She was like hysterical. She was just screaming, you know, call to the mom.
And then he came over the radio.
And this is another part of the biography that I tell superficially. I am sure that many who are now watching this film will catch themselves thinking that they do not know any details about Marciano's death, except that he died in a plane crash. Story about how and why Rocky died a little from afar. When I got to know Rocky Marciano better, I immediately realized that his god was a dollar, and I liked it.
And lived what is possibly one of the most bizarre lives following his career as anybody I've ever looked at in sports. I mean, he would only take cash at functions. He hid money in pipes, in wall outlets. He opened up bank accounts that were not in his name and put money in there. Nobody knows today where all of Rocky's money is.
I can't fully explain it, but he had not only a lust for money, but a lust for cash. If it were possible to avoid it, he would not accept checks. For one thing, he never wanted to pay taxes on anything. And the other thing, he just liked the feel and the look of cash. $2,000 in cash meant more to him than a $50,000 check, which doesn't make any financial sense, but that's the way it was.
He was offered a $5,000 check once up in Montreal for giving a speech after dinner, and he told the man at the dinner party, he says, "I'm sorry, I don't take checks." And his accountant who was with him said, "Rocky, this is a cashier's check. It's like money." He said, "Don't tell me my business. I want cash." So the chairman of the dinner had to go all around the room, black tie dinner, and collect cash from the people. And he gave him $2,500, and Rocky gave him the check and said, "Thank you."
Here's what historian Bird Sugar tells us about the last day of Rocky Marciano's life.
Again, Rocky Marciano's love of the dollar. It was the day before his birthday. He was supposed to be going home to spend it with his family. Right. And yet, somebody came to him and said, "I would give you a couple bucks if you will come to Des Moines," a contractor friend of his, "and appear at a birthday party we'll throw up there. Then you can go up home, on home. Let's give you money for a ticket for a plane." Well, wouldn't you know it, Marciano decided not to spend the money on the plane. He went with another friend on a flight to Des Moines, and it never landed.
This is only the first part of the story for now, and here's the second one. I already mentioned that Frankie Fratto was on board with Rocky. His father was Luigi Fratto, nicknamed Cross-Eyed Louie, who came from a family of Italian immigrants and was a former boxer. But he became famous not for boxing at all, since out of 7 fights he won only 2. Cross-Eyed Louie is one of the most famous racketeers of criminal figures in Chicago in the period 40-60. He conducted business not only in the state of Illinois, but also in the state of Iowa, where Des Moines is located. In Iowa, he was involved in the distribution of alcoholic beverages in collaboration with the Capone family. His brother, Frankie One Ear, helped Cross-Eyed Louie solve problems. Here he is in the photo with Rocky. It's still a family judging by their nicknames, But the one-eared one, unlike the cross-eyed one, was a good shot, and he was a hired killer. Although the cross-eyed one also once shot a man who tried to extort money from him. Perhaps he shot by accident, but a fact is a fact. Cross-eyed Louis died in 1967, but his business continued to live, including with the help of his children. And one of the sons of cross-eyed Louis, Frankie, was just on the plane that crashed with Rocky Marciano. And the party that Rocky was flying to was organized by the Fratto family. Marciano could have taken a regular flight because he was given money for a ticket. On the other hand, we can say that he earned money for his family. As you can see, Rocky Marciano's career and his life were not as uniquely beautiful and flawless as is often presented in videos or documentaries about him. The emphasis is on 49-0, but no one wants to go into details. And as we have already found out, behind the 49-0 track record lies a careful selection of opponents, as well as several gifts from his influential patrons. I already said once that in those years, the philosophy of boxing was different from today. If you have 0 in the position column, it means you have not met the strongest opponents, or met them when they were past their best years. And unfortunately, this is the case with the Brockton blockbuster. It would have been interesting to see Ezzard Charles fight at least a couple of years earlier, so that Archie Moore is given at least a couple of months to rest. It would also be very interesting to watch a fight against Ingemar Johansson, Floyd Patterson, and Sonny Liston. When these guys were at the top, Rocky was not yet an old man. In 1960, when Patterson was champion and Liston was the #1 contender, Rocky was 37 years old. The man he beat, Archie Moore, was still competing and was still the light heavyweight champion of the world. In general, the perception of Rocky Marciano has parallels with the perception of Sonny Liston. The only difference is that Rocky is considered an exclusively positive hero, and Rocky is considered an exclusively negative one. And here I recommend watching a documentary about Sonny Liston. When you begin to delve into the essence, you understand that the established image can differ from the real state of affairs. For example, a pass to big boxing was given to the good guy Marciano and the bad Liston by the same person, Frankie Carbo. If Liston was not a close person for Carbo, then Rocky was. Marciano often dined at Carbo's house, and Marciano put much more dirty Mafia money in his pocket than Liston, because in the early 60s, the influence of the Mafia on boxing began to decline sharply, and this happened because the IBC company was put under pressure, and Carbo was sent to prison in 1961 for almost the rest of his life for extortion. By the way, Robert Kennedy was the prosecutor at Frankie Carbo's meeting, younger brother of John Kennedy. And as we see, even after the end of his career, Rocky did not mind going for money and making a speech at a party for a family of racketeers. I don't want you to get the impression that I'm trying to find anything negative in Rocky's career and life, or to discredit a man who is generally considered a hero. I'm just trying to tell you the full story of a person. Describe the personality not in separate parts that will make you move with admiration, but completely. And I'm sure that some facts about Rocky Marciano have become a real discovery for you. Everyone is interested in knowing what a person really was like, and I don't really like it when, after years, they try to mold the big names of the past into saints, or, on the contrary, villains, by hushing up certain details, as is the case with Sonny Liston. Rocky was no saint. Like Liston, he made mistakes and had his weaknesses. In general, he was a person, and while making this film, I wanted to talk about all the rounds in Marciano's career and life, and not just the ones he won. Would you like me to tell you something else? I'm sure you didn't know this. What do you think these photos look like? That's right, they look like a photo of a person after his arrest, and they were made in July 1944. While in the service, Rocky often visited British pubs, and one evening, while intoxicated, he and his friend, a colleague, took the wallet from the Englishman. Marciano was arrested by military police and faced up to 7 years of forced labor. He was forgiven for his military and boxing services. However, they added 12 months to the service life. I think now you understand why I repeatedly said throughout the film that a very significant number of important facts from the life of Rocky Marciano are ignored, and yet Rocky Marciano, in my opinion, is an extraordinary hero in the history of world boxing. The Brockton blockbuster proves something very important. The story of a boxer working his way up from the bottom is nothing new. This was before Rocky Marciano, and this was after. But let's remember some examples and not go far. Let's take a look at Rocky's rivals. Joe Louis, Archie Moore, Ezzard Charles. It wasn't easy for them either, and the path of the same Charles was much more difficult than that of Rocky. But Ezzard was a natural boxer, a true genius who didn't need a trainer. Rocky Marciano was not a boxing genius. He became a boxer simply because he had no choice. He dreamed of becoming a baseball player, or at least a football player, and boxing came into his life because he was tired of peeling potatoes. That's why his story is different from the vast majority of truly legendary boxers. He was forced to do so, but still he achieved success, fame, recognition, and earned a lot of money. And he did it solely on character. Of course, at times they helped him, but he is not alone in this. Joe Louis, Jersey Joe Walcott, and Muhammad Ali received gifts from the judges. There is no point in listing further. The vast majority of famous champions of any era have dubious victories in their careers. And here you can look at the situation from a different angle. Yes, Rocky fell into strong hands and, thanks to his origins, became the favorite of very influential people from criminal structures who created the right image for him and built a career that was amazing in terms of financial efficiency and recognition, calculating every step and squeezing out the maximum amount of money. They managed to make it so that decades later, some are sure that there is no heavyweight better than Rocky Marciano. But all this still needed to be achieved. Rocky was far from the only poor guy of Italian descent who wanted to get to the top of professional boxing. There were thousands of them, but only one got in, Rocky Marciano from Brockton, Massachusetts. Rocky's story is the story of a man who achieved success despite the lack of outstanding boxing talent. Don't get me wrong, this doesn't mean he had no talent at all. Still, he had a very hard blow by nature. But Rocky showed that you don't have to be the biggest, the strongest, or the smartest to rise to the top. The determining factors can be character and the will to achieve success. In the USA, there is a popular motivational speaker named Eric Thomas who often repeats one phrase: if you want to be successful as much as you want to breathe, then you will be successful. This is probably the phrase that best describes how Rocky Marciano overcame the path from a simple guy from a poor family to the status of one of the biggest legends in world boxing.